Who did not allow people of lower caste to fill water in India in the 19th century? This has been explained very well in this video. Watch it completely and share it as much as possible. In the dusty village of Bhagirathpur, nestled along the parched banks of a receding river in 19th century India, the sun hung heavy over the cracked earth, and the air pulsed with an oppressive stillness, broken only by the desperate cries of birds circling in search of water. The village was divided not by walls, but by centuries of customs, by beliefs stronger than stone, by an invisible line drawn deep into the consciousness of its people, a line that separated the high from the low, the touchable from the untouchable. At the center of this invisible line stood the village well, a deep, circular stone structure ringed by an ornate iron fence, its surface polished smooth by the calloused hands of those allowed to draw from it, and kept untouched by those forbidden even to approach. It was not just a source of water, it was a monument to power, a shrine of control wielded by the dominant caste, the Brahmins and the wealthy landlords who had for generations upheld their ancestral privilege by controlling access to the very source of life. Among the villagers, the well was more sacred than the temple. No one questioned who could and couldn't draw water from it, not publicly at least. The lower castes, labeled untouchables by both language and law, were condemned to wait for mercy, to seek out distant streams, or to hope for the kindness of a higher caste woman who might pour water from above without letting their shadows touch. Ramu, a wiry boy of 12 with dark, sun-scorched skin and eyes that burned with the premature weight of understanding, had known this line all his life. He had watched his mother Sita carry water from the distant polluted pond 3 miles away, while high caste women filled gleaming copper pots just minutes from their huts. He had heard her cries when she had returned one evening to find that the water had leaked through the cracked earthen pot, and he had seen the scars left by walking barefoot on burning gravel roads, her feet cut and blistered from years of forced distance. Sita had been born into the Chamar caste, the lowest of the low in Bhagirathpur's hierarchy, and had been made to understand from birth that her touch was impure, her presence unwanted, her thirst irrelevant. Her ancestors had been leather workers, her grandfather a tanner who processed hides by the riverside and lived in a shanty built from waste discarded by Brahmin households. That legacy of humiliation lingered not just in memory, but in every glance she received, in the silence when she approached, in the way people moved away from her shadow like it carried contagion. Ramu did not accept these things as quietly as others. He was young, not yet molded entirely by the rules, and his mind was filled with questions no one dared ask. Why must they walk miles for water that flowed under their feet? Why could they not stand in line like the rest? Why did birth determine worth? He had watched, hidden behind thorny bushes, how the priest's son Keshav had urinated in the village pond, the same pond Ramu's family had to drink from because they were not allowed to touch the well. He had watched as Keshav had laughed and dared his friends to do the same. Ramu had also watched the village headman, Thakur Hariram Singh, a man with a thick mustache and a heart made of old rituals, order his servants to beat a lower caste girl who had tried to touch the rope of the village well during a drought. "The well is not for your kind," Thakur had thundered. "Your filth will poison the gods." The girl had bled, and no one had protested. Ramu remembered her screams even now, years later, how they had echoed in the night like a curse. She had vanished from the village days later, her family forced to leave under the cover of darkness, and no one ever spoke of her again. The story of Bhagirathpur was not unique. Across the subcontinent, the same play unfolded with different names and faces. In the Maratha lands to the west, in the rice-rich fields of Tamil Nadu, in the arid plains of Rajasthan. The well was not just a structure, it was a test of caste. The Manusmriti, an ancient law code revered by Orthodox Brahmins, had codified these divisions, stating that lower castes must live outside the village, use separate wells, and never contaminate the resources used by the higher varnas. These texts were cited by the village priests, who themselves bathed in water drawn by their wives from the sacred well, but would not allow their shadows to fall on the poor who served them. The British, in their cold administrative way, ignored this segregation. Their policies classified the population, but made no effort to undo the caste order. They used it, instead, to maintain control. In census documents and tax rolls, they reinforced caste identities, and in courts, they allowed Brahminical arguments to determine social rights. To them, it was a native custom, best left alone. Their silence allowed the system to deepen. In Bhagirathpur, the situation worsened one summer when the river dried completely, and even the distant pond became a patch of thick green sludge. People fell sick: cholera, dysentery, fever. But the well was full, protected by ancient stone and shaded by neem trees. Ramu watched day after day as women in silk saris came and went, their pots overflowing, while his mother's lips cracked from thirst. One day, unable to take it any longer, Ramu crept toward the well at dawn, when the fog still clung to the earth and only the birds bore witness. He touched the outer stone of the well and felt its coolness, a sacred coolness denied to his kind. Then he reached for the rope, hands trembling, heart pounding. He had just begun to lower the bucket when he heard a shout. It was Pandit Dinanath, the village priest who lived next to the well and had seen the movement through his narrow window slit. "Rogue!" he screamed, running out with a stick. "You defile the gods' water? You want us to drink your filth?" He dragged Ramu by the collar, striking him across the back, the legs, the shoulders, shouting until neighbors woke and gathered. They didn't ask what happened. They didn't need to. A crowd formed, and Ramu's hands were tied. Thakur Hariram was summoned, and before long it was declared that Ramu must be punished as an example. Sita begged. She fell at their feet. "He is a child," she cried. "He was thirsty. That is all." But mercy was not for their kind. Ramu was locked in a grain storage shed for 2 days without food. He was denied water, the same water he had dared to touch. When he emerged, his eyes were bloodshot, but his spirit had not been broken. That night, he asked his mother a question. "Is there any place in this land," he said, "where we can drink water without begging?" Sita looked away. "I heard of such places," she whispered. "In Bombay, in places where the people march, where the voices rise against this cruelty." Ramu listened, and a seed took root. What followed in Bhagirathpur was not immediate rebellion, but something slower, a quiet gathering of dissatisfaction, of whispered questions and secret meetings. More children began to ask why they must wait. A teacher himself from a backward caste came from a nearby town and began to speak to the young about rights. He had read about a man named Jyotirao Phule, who in Pune had opened schools for untouchables and had declared that no god worth worshipping could permit such cruelty. Ramu listened carefully. He learned to read, he learned to write. He read about a man named Buddha, who had once walked the same soil and had declared that all beings were equal. He read about how the British Empire was weak in its heart, that it feared mass unrest, and how some reformers were rising in Calcutta and madrasas to challenge the orthodoxy. These stories lit a fire in him. One day he told the teacher, "I will return to this well and drink from it, not alone, but with 100 like me. And if they stop us, the whole world will hear of it." That day would come, but first, more had to suffer, and more had to awaken. Across the country, the caste system tightened its grip, even as the voices against it grew louder. I will now continue with the second part of the story. In the decades leading up to the mid-19th century, the social fabric of Indian villages was tightly woven with customs and rituals that reinforced the rigid caste hierarchy. These customs ensured that the Dalits, often called untouchables, were excluded not only from social and religious life, but even from the most basic human necessity, access to clean water. Wells, ponds, and rivers were not just sources of hydration, they were symbols of purity and pollution. In the minds of the upper castes, the pollution caused by the presence or touch of Dalits was believed to taint the water, angering the gods and threatening the entire community's well-being. In Bhagirathpur and countless other villages like it, this belief dictated the harshest of exclusions. Dalits were forced to rely on small, stagnant ponds far from the village center, or on rainwater collected in makeshift containers. These water sources were often filthy, breeding grounds for waterborne diseases that ravaged their communities. The refusal to allow Dalits access to village wells wasn't merely a social slight, it was a systemic method of oppression that perpetuated their poverty, ill health, and social isolation. Meanwhile, the upper caste villagers treated the well as a sacred entity, maintaining it meticulously, decorating it during festivals, and performing religious ceremonies around it. They believed that allowing impure hands to draw water would desecrate the well, bringing divine wrath. This conviction was enforced not only by social pressure, but by brutal physical punishments. Stories of Dalits being beaten, humiliated, or even killed for attempting to draw water from the main well were whispered in fear. One such story that haunted Bhagirathpur was that of Lalu, a young Dalit man who had dared to draw water from the well during a famine. Desperation had driven him to action. His mother was sick, and their pond had dried up. Lalu had crept to the well in the dead of night, hoping to fill a pot unnoticed. But the village guards caught him. Before the entire village, he was dragged to the square, tied to a post, and publicly whipped. The punishment was so severe that he died weeks later from infection. His family was exiled, and the villagers warned one another that such acts would be met with swift justice. Despite these horrors, subtle cracks began to appear in the edifice of caste-based water discrimination by the late 19th century. The British colonial administration, while largely indifferent to social reform, introduced census-taking and legal codifications that inadvertently highlighted the injustices faced by Dalits. Reformist thinkers within India began to challenge the legitimacy of caste-based exclusions, and a few courageous individuals stepped forward to organize resistance. Ramu's generation was born into this ferment of change, inspired by reformers like Jyotirao Phule and later Dr. Ambedkar. Dalits began to question their assigned place in society. In Bhagirathpur, Ramu himself became a young man deeply involved in such efforts. With his teacher's guidance, he educated himself and others, teaching them to read and write, and explaining the power of the law and public opinion. The turning point in Bhagirathpur's struggle came during an unusually dry year, when the well's water level was dangerously low. The village headman, Thakur Hariram Singh, declared that only Brahmins and high caste would be permitted to draw water for their fields and homes. The Dalits were ordered to survive on the contaminated pond water alone. This decree sparked outrage among the Dalit community. Led by Ramu, they gathered secretly to plan their response. They sent petitions to British officials, citing laws that promised equality under the law, and held meetings to prepare for a peaceful protest. When the day came, Ramu and a group of 50 Dalits marched boldly to the village well, carrying empty pots and chanting slogans demanding their right to access clean water. The village guards tried to stop them, and a tense standoff ensued. Some upper caste villagers gathered, shouting curses and threats. But the presence of British officials, who had been alerted by the petitions, prevented immediate violence. A legal case was filed, drawing attention to the issue beyond Bhagirathpur. The ensuing trial was groundbreaking. For the first time, the voices of Dalits were heard in a colonial court. Advocates argued that denying access to water based on caste was a violation of fundamental human rights and public health laws. While the British judiciary was cautious, it ordered that the Dalits be allowed to draw water from the well under supervision. This ruling did not erase caste prejudices overnight, but it marked a significant step toward dismantling the system. The village well became a contested space where tradition clashed with emerging ideas of equality. Over the years, similar movements spread across the region, slowly eroding caste-based restrictions on water access. Ramu's story, and those like his, became part of a larger narrative of resistance that would ultimately feed into the anti-caste movements of the 20th century. The struggle for water rights was not just a fight for hydration, it was a fight for dignity, for justice, and for recognition of shared humanity. As the decades passed, the struggle over the well in Bhagirathpur became a symbol of the larger fight against caste oppression in rural India. Ramu, now a man in his 30s, had become a respected leader within his community. His fiery speeches and unyielding determination inspired many, but they also made him a target of the entrenched powers. Thakur Hariram Singh, who had once ruled the village with iron authority, had grown old but remained fiercely opposed to any change in the social order. He saw Ramu's efforts as a threat to the gods, the traditions, and his own power. One sweltering summer afternoon, a crisis erupted. The village's irrigation canal broke, threatening the crops and the livelihood of everyone. The upper caste landlords argued fiercely over who should pay for repairs. Meanwhile, the Dalit farmers, whose lands were neglected by the canal system, had no access to water for their crops. When Ramu proposed that the village pool resources to repair the canal fairly and insisted that the Dalit should receive their share of water, the upper caste erupted in fury. They accused Ramu of inciting rebellion and disrespecting caste laws. Despite the threats, Ramu organized a group of young men and women to begin repairs themselves. They worked in the heat, digging and clearing debris, often under hostile gazes and threats. But word spread, and soon some sympathetic members of the higher castes, especially younger men, who had begun to question the old ways after exposure to English education and reformist ideas, joined the effort. This alliance, fragile but hopeful, marked the beginning of real change in Bhagirathpur. The day the canal was repaired, a crowd gathered near the well. For the first time in decades, Dalits and upper castes drew water side by side. The well water sparkled in the sun, a shared resource for all. Children laughed and splashed as the elders watched silently, some with reluctant acceptance, others with quiet fury. Yet the path ahead was far from smooth. Old prejudices died hard. There were secret meetings where plans were made to reverse the progress. Rumors circulated that Ramu and his supporters were blasphemers, enemies of the gods. One night, a fire was set at Ramu's home, destroying years of books and documents that he had painstakingly collected about caste reform and rights. But the fire could not burn the spirit that had taken root. Ramu's wife, Meera, a woman of fierce resolve and gentle kindness, stood by him through every trial. She organized women's groups that taught literacy and hygiene, emphasizing the connection between clean water and health. These women, once resigned to silence, began to speak out, sharing stories of suffering and hope. They held ceremonies at the well, not as a place of exclusion, but as a gathering point for community unity. Over time, Bhagirathpur's story drew attention from neighboring villages and reformers in the cities. The Indian National Congress, formed in 1885, began to address social issues alongside political ones. Leaders like Dr. Ambedkar, himself from a Dalit background, spoke passionately about dismantling caste-based barriers, including those around access to water and sanitation. The growing momentum of social reform and nationalism intertwined, strengthening the cause of equality. By the early 20th century, laws began to reflect these changing attitudes. Acts were passed prohibiting discrimination in public water sources and banning untouchability. Enforcement was uneven and met with resistance, but the legal framework was established. Educational campaigns spread awareness, and younger generations grew up questioning inherited prejudices. Bhagirathpur itself became a microcosm of these transformations. Where once Dalits had been forced to collect water from toxic ponds miles away, now children from all castes drank from a shared well, their laughter blending together without fear. The scars of the past lingered, but the new stories written in the village's memory were those of courage, resistance, and gradual healing. Ramu's journey, from a thirsty boy who dared to touch the forbidden well to a leader who fought for justice, became a beacon for many. His story reminds us that water is more than a resource, it is a right, and that the fight for water access is inseparable from the fight for human dignity. How did you like this video? Please tell us in the comment below and share this video as much as possible. Thank you very much for watching this video.